Ukraine has liberated strategic villages deep in contested territory, while Russian forces have hemorrhaged over 50,000 casualties in a single punishing phase of this war. Not metaphorically, not in some abstract projection. Literally. Right now, Ukrainian assault units are advancing through smoke-filled fields, raising the blue and yellow flag over positions that Moscow swore would never fall again. Russian dead and wounded litter the approaches in numbers that defy their own mobilization math. This is not a tactical adjustment. This is not attrition warfare as planned. This is the doctrinal death spiral that I've been warning about for months, finally revealing itself in the open. What you are witnessing is not random movement on a map. It is proof, irrefutable proof, that Russia's entire theory of victory has failed. Putin bet everything on mass, on sheer volume, on the idea that Ukraine would break before his endless supply of conscripts and convicts ran out. He was wrong, catastrophically wrong. And the villages now flying Ukrainian flags are the visible evidence that the adaptation race is over. Ukraine has adapted. Russia has not. And what happens next changes everything. Let me walk you through exactly what this means at the strategic level, because the mainstream coverage is still treating this as another footnote in a long war. It is not. This is the moment the math breaks for Moscow. Pull the lens back with me for a second. Russia entered this phase believing their fortified lines, their artillery dominance, and their human wave reinforcements would grind Ukraine into exhaustion. They assumed that sheer numbers would always overcome technology, training, and tactical innovation. That assumption just died in the fields outside those liberated villages. Go back to the Russian planning documents we have all seen echoed in their own state media. Moscow's generals told Putin that Ukrainian counteroffensives would stall because the Ukrainian army lacked the manpower, the shells, and the will to sustain prolonged assaults. They told him that their own defensive belts, minefields, dragon's teeth, layered artillery would turn every Ukrainian advance into a slaughter. They told him that Western support would waver and that sanctions would bite harder on Kiev than on the Kremlin. Every single one of those assumptions has now been shredded by Ukrainian forces operating with precision, innovation, and relentless tempo. The villages did not liberate themselves. They were taken because Ukraine understood the modern battlefield in ways Russia still refuses to accept. Now let's look at the milestone chronology that brought us here, because the numbers do not lie and they are devastating. Over the past several weeks, Ukrainian units, supported by drone reconnaissance, precision artillery, and coordinated mechanized assaults, have executed a textbook operation to retake key villages in the Dnipropetrovsk and southern sectors. First came the shaping phase, relentless drone strikes that blinded Russian forward observers and destroyed command nodes. Then came the fire support, hundreds of precision munitions delivered exactly where they hurt most. Then came the ground push, small, highly trained assault groups moving under cover of electronic warfare that jammed Russian communications and left their artillery batteries firing blind. In one documented stretch alone, Russian forces lost 22 armored vehicles attempting to reinforce a single village that is now back under Ukrainian control. That is not a footnote. That is a doctrinal indictment. Russian doctrine still teaches massed armor as the decisive arm. Ukrainian forces have turned that into a liability. Every time a Russian column tried to counterattack, Ukrainian drones and artillery turned the approach roads into kill zones. We are talking about convoys of 40, 50, even 60 vehicles shredded in hours. And the human cost? Russian casualties climbed past the 40,000 mark before the villages even fell. By the time Ukrainian flags rose over Orostopol, Novoselivka, Sosnivka, Koroshi, and Vorony, the total had crossed 50,000. 50,000 in a single operational phase? That is more than many entire Russian brigades, and it gets even more serious from here. Watch the pattern. Russia responded the only way they know how, by throwing more bodies at the problem, more convicts, more mobilized reservists, more North Korean fillers where they could get them. They doubled down on the very tactic that has failed them for 3 years. Ukrainian forces simply adjusted. They used terrain, they used night operations, they used cheap commercial drones retrofitted with military-grade precision to turn Russian mass into Russian graves. The hidden military variable here, the one Moscow still cannot solve, is Ukrainian doctrinal adaptation at every level. From the private, with a drone controller, to the brigade commander integrating fires, Ukraine is operating as a learning organization. Russia is operating as a hierarchy that punishes learning. Now pull the lens back further to the industrial and state level consequences, because this is where the real strategic collapse begins to bite. Those 50,000 casualties are not just numbers on a ledger. They represent a manpower hemorrhage that Russia's birth rate and mobilization system cannot replace. Every dead or maimed Russian soldier is a father, a son, a worker taken out of the economy. Every destroyed vehicle is a tank or BMP that their factories, already under sanctions pressure, cannot rebuild fast enough. We are seeing Russian oil refineries burning from deep strikes, their rail network strained, their defense industry working triple shifts just to keep up with the attrition rate these village fights demand. This is the compounding effect I have been describing since the beginning. Russia's economy is now fully subordinated to the war. Their budget is war. Their industry is war. Their demographics are war. And yet they are losing ground. Ukraine, by contrast, is liberating territory while preserving combat power through superior technology and tactics. Every liberated village frees up Ukrainian logistics lines, shortens supply routes, and creates new jumping-off points for the next phase. The industrial logic is merciless. Russia is spending blood and treasure at a rate that accelerates their own exhaustion, while Ukraine is spending smart, using Western systems, domestic innovation, and asymmetric advantage to multiply every soldier's effectiveness. Let me make this crystal clear with the doctrinal lens. Russian military doctrine still rests on the Soviet-era model of massed fires, centralized command, and human wave follow-on forces. It worked against a peer that played by the same rules in the last century. It does not work against an opponent that has integrated commercial drones, Starlink-enabled command, precision Western munitions, and decentralized decision-making at the platoon level. The villages prove it. Russian forces arrived expecting static defense lines to hold. Ukrainian forces treated those lines as targets of opportunity. The result, Russian command posts destroyed before they could react, artillery batteries silenced by loitering munitions, and infantry companies evaporated before they could dig in. Why does mainstream coverage keep missing this? Because they are still reporting the war as two armies trading villages in an endless slog. They miss the asymmetry. They miss the adaptation gap. They miss the fact that every Russian victory costs them more than they can afford, while every Ukrainian advance builds momentum. The hidden variable again, Ukraine is not just fighting with weapons. They are fighting with doctrine that learns faster than Russia can adapt. That is why 50,000 casualties later, those strategic villages are Ukrainian again. Now we arrive at the climactic turning point operation itself, the one that sealed the fate of this phase and exposed Putin's strategy for the disaster it has become. Ukrainian assault regiments, after a 100-day shaping operation, synchronized a multi-domain strike package that Russian intelligence never saw coming. It began with deep drone raids that disrupted Russian rear area logistics. It continued with electronic warfare dominance that blinded their sensors. And it culminated in ground forces moving under a protective umbrella of fires that turned Russian counterattacks into suicide missions. Specific numbers tell the story. Over 240 Ukrainian drones employed in the first 48 hours alone, 84 confirmed strikes on command nodes, and Russian losses mounting so rapidly that their own commanders began pulling units off the line rather than reinforce a lost cause. The villages fell in sequence, each liberation exposing the next Russian position. Russian forces that were supposed to be elite, guards units, airborne, motorized rifle brigades, broke and ran, equipment worth hundreds of millions of dollars left behind or destroyed. And the psychological blow? Devastating. Russian soldiers now know that the promised meat grinder victory is a lie. Their own commanders are sending them into kill zones with no air cover, no reliable artillery support, and no realistic path to victory. This is not sustainable. This is collapse in slow motion. What happens next changes everything. Putin has lost the initiative. He has lost the narrative. He has lost the ability to hide the scale of the failure from his own people and from his own generals. The strategic villages are back in Ukrainian hands. The casualty count is unsustainable. And the larger pattern is now undeniable. Russia's assumptions about modern warfare were built on a foundation of sand. Ukraine's doctrine of adaptation, integration, and precision is the new standard, and that standard is winning. Let that sink in. Putin thought distance, numbers, and brute force would save him. Ukraine ended that illusion. Russia's most feared defensive lines have been breached. Their elite units have been exposed as brittle. Their war machine, which looked unstoppable on paper, is being dismantled village by village, sector by sector. History will record this phase not as another inconclusive battle, but as the moment the Russian army's doctrinal bankruptcy became impossible to deny. The real question now is not whether Ukraine can sustain this tempo. The real question is how much longer Russia can pretend their strategy is working. Because every liberated village, every 1,000 casualties, every destroyed battalion brings us closer to the point where Moscow has no choice but to confront the truth. They are losing the adaptation race, they are losing the manpower race, and they are losing the war. Stay with us because those questions do not have simple answers. The next phase is already forming, and when it arrives, it will not be Russia dictating terms. It will be Ukraine continuing to expose the structural weaknesses that Putin's entire regime was built upon. This is the pattern. This is the reality. And this is why the liberation of these strategic villages, paid for with 50,000 Russian casualties, may well be remembered as the beginning of the end for Putin's imperial adventure. What you have just seen is not chaos, it is consequence. Russian overconfidence meeting Ukrainian competence. And the verdict is already in. The side that adapts survives. The side that does not collapses. History is watching. And right now it is watching Ukraine write the next chapter.